Welcome to the Center in the City podcast. I'm your host, Wade Brill, and during this series, I'll be interviewing various thought leaders, wellness experts, and humans on how they practice sustainable self-care and mindfulness. We'll get real and raw, talk about the light and the shadow side of self-care and mindfulness, and how we can actually stay centered amid the chaos and the hustle and bustle of our modern day world. So settle in and get centered. This podcast episode is brought to you by Centered in the City, a virtual on-demand self-care and mindfulness platform with over 100 different meditations, journaling prompts, nourishing recipes, and Pilates flows, all designed to support you feeling calm, focused, and energized as you live your life in this modern day world. For more information, head on over to centeredinthecity.org and claim your 7-day free trial. Welcome back to the Center in the City podcast. Today on the podcast, Kathy Onetto of Sustainable Ambition and I are doing a part 2 to our discussion around pace. So if you haven't already checked out episode 116, I welcome you to check it out. We talk a lot about pace in how it feels, how do we know when to use fast pace, slow pace, just really kind of exploring the essence of pace. And in today's episode, we take it a step further and talk about how do we use pace in terms of goal setting, in terms of collaborating with our partners in how we want to live life and support each other in our ambitions. We talk about how pace gets to be a helpful short-term and long-term tool to help us think about what we want to prioritize. So settle into this episode and let's get centered.
So Wade, on this conversation, we're going to keep our conversation on pace going. And we wanted to focus on how we think about pace and how it relates to striving and goals. And so that was something that came up for both of us as we kind of were thinking about pace. So we kind of talked last time about pace and how we experience it, and when does fast pace work for us? When does slow pace work? How do we know if it feels good or not? But when you think about it, what do you think people need to think about when considering pace of life and goals?
Yeah. Oh God, this is such a big question, because I would say if you asked me when I was a teenager, I would think you have, your whole life to achieve these big, awesome things and, enjoy the journey kind of. However, I was diagnosed with cancer at the age of 21. And at the same time, I lost my mother to her own battle with cancer. And so this became a huge rupture in my life of how short and precious life is and can be. And that created a huge sense of urgency in me and a huge sense of life is short. So if we have goals and ambitions, the time is now. You just got to do it. You can't assume you can achieve that in your 30s or 40s or 50s. And so it really created this pressure shift, which then created a lot of anxiety for me. And I remember after getting healthy and I was trying to look for other young adult survivors, because young adult survivors are a very interesting bracket between, there are a lot of children with cancer and there are a lot of adults with cancer, but young adults is this very small niche community. And it was hard to find people. And I was curious to hear if they felt that same way, that they felt that anxiety. And I didn't get that sense from that many people that I connected to around it. However, I kind of sat with that and had to learn how to not let the anxiety be my driver on achieving my goals, because that was making me feel like I had to be reactive with my goals. And if I wasn't achieving my goals, then I was failing. And if I was failing, then what if I died the next day? And then what was my life? So it just created this huge spiral. So I think pace is huge then to bring it back into this conversation around goals and ambition and how we're being with it.
Yeah, wow, that's so powerful, Wade. And I'm wondering where you sit with that now. Have you found a way to kind of like look at your goals and kind of be like, I don't have to achieve it all right now. Like, yes, life is short, but there's no way I can put 100 years of living, say, into the next year. So, how do you kind of sit with that, or how do you kind of think about that pacing now?
Yes. So I've had to switch my relationship to the word goals because I don't use goals as the end all be all. What I really ground into are setting intentions. So at the beginning of the year, I have a workshop around this and I do this process myself, and I call it the intention setting party workshop. And it's an opportunity to think about, what's my word of the year? What's my kind of mindset motto for the year? And this year it's bold and love. So I then think about, okay, how do I get to live bold and love in all of the areas of my life? And then what are some tangible goals or actions that I want to create through this lens of bold and love? And so that then helps me feel like I'm living in alignment and doing things that feel connected to me and how I want to live versus, I need to read 20 books by the end of the year, and I need to make this much money in 2022, and I want to travel to this many places. And because that feels so random and like pressurized. And so when I come from this place of intention and allow that to be my lens, it helps create a steady pace so that I'm connected to the goals and there's a deep sense of why that's keeping me connected.
Mm, I love that. And it makes me think about this question that I was wondering about as we were talking about this topic, which is, what are some of the challenges around finding the right pace around goals? And you sharing that brought up, I was listening to a podcast episode recently where the speaker talked about this idea of like, where does your rating scale come from? Right. And so these rating scales that we have that create these external pressures around goals, say, and like have to get there fast or what have you, can put this external pressure and define things in a way that isn't so supportive of us around pacing things in our life, if you will. And so I'm going there, I guess, because I'm sensing this setting an intention, I think, points you in a better direction perhaps than kind of sometimes these external rating scales that we're working with.
When you say rating scales, Kathy, tell me a little bit more. Like, are we saying that as this is good and this is bad, or like, I give them 5 stars versus 2 stars?
Yeah, it's kind of like if you think about how does society define success, and even around this idea of pace, like where do I think we get some things wrong around defining goals and pace. And it's kind of like, well, you should get to the top fast. Like in some ways, okay, I get it, that's admirable, right? But like I kind of hate these like lists, like the 30 under 30, right, or the 40 under 40.
Oh my God, yes,
you know. And so I think these external rating scales where we have these measures of what we think success is, as opposed to setting our own intentions for our selves and our lives and our goals, or what we're trying to achieve, instead of feeling this intensity. I don't know. I'm trying to thread the needle there.
No,
yeah.
No, you're bringing up I think a really important point, and I appreciate you elaborating on what you meant by ratings. Because for instance, I just started working with this client who is about to turn 40, and similar to like when you turn 30, these big milestones become this moment of like, holy shit, where am I in my life? Am I doing what matters? What have I accomplished? That can spiral people into, how have I been living? And I think it's a beautiful opportunity to take a moment. I'm a huge person, you and I both being coaches, right? We're big fans of taking that time to reflect and connect the dots in our life. And but it's true. It's like 40 is such an arbitrary number. 30 is such an arbitrary number. It's just made up in society as like you're supposed to be here at these different stages of life where those don't really matter. They're made up. Our world has made them up. And then we create kind of judgments then on ourselves about where we should or shouldn't be along those, societal beliefs.
For sure. Yeah. And it creates a lot of unnecessary pressure, right? In terms of these milestones I'm supposed to get to. And we talked about this idea around like how pacing can get complicated when you bring comparison into it. And again, you're looking externally to yourself. And that can be on a number of different measures. Like, as you're saying, am I where like, if I'm comparing myself to other people, am I where other people are in this journey? And that can be both on professional life, it can be on in personal life as well, where you start to feel this external pressure to kind of like speed up your life, if you will, or and instead of just kind of living in your own journey. I'm curious what you think about that, Wade, in terms of like how comparison kind of shows up in this narrative too.
Well, yeah. And it makes me curious, Kathy, to even just highlight like these ambitious achievers that I know both of us love to work with. It's like how that mindset is so built up in how they identify themselves and how they find purpose and I don't want to say like it's wrong or right, but I think when we compare we despair typically. And so it can be really helpful to recognize when are we in these comparison loops and putting ourselves in these rating boxes that don't mean anything, and when can we create our own level of success? Like, what does success actually look like? What are goals that are actually important to ourselves? What are deadlines or declared dates that actually feel meaningful and purposeful to us, not because society's saying, we need to have 3 kids and a house and a dog at the age of 33.
Yeah, for sure. And I think what you're bringing up for me, Wade, is some of the stuff that I talk about with sustainable ambition, where I want to champion people looking to define success for themselves and also really being honest about their own ambitions and then aligning pace to that, and really to look at how do I align ambition and pace together. And just because I don't think people look at this very often, I think we're saying, we like to talk about this concept of pace, but we don't think people like think about it. We often just let life take us, right? And the rhythm of life take us, as opposed to kind of being intentional, going back to your word you said earlier. And I just think it's so important because, I personally feel, and I talk about this, that I think that our ambitions ebb and flow over time. And I also think, as you're saying, when people get to some of those inflection points in their life, they get surprised by it, and they aren't aware, because it's not something we talk about that much, that our ambitions can go up and down, or our desire to kind of change our pace or our focus can shift. And so I think it's helpful to kind of start the dialogue around some of that, and to really look to align those for ourselves.
Kathy, where do you feel like ambition comes from? Do you feel like it's a trait we're born with? Is it something you learn from society? Like, I'm just curious what you've kind of noticed with your clients or even yourself.
Well, it's funny because I'm digging into ambition a bit right now, and based on my reading and some recent, things that I've been listening to as well, my takeaway is that ambition, to be human, is to be ambitious. And there are
Love that.
these very natural parts of ourself that, like the conversation that I'll link to this podcast in the show notes, but like this was from a Being Well podcast, and the conversation what they were talking about was, it's a very natural thing both in humans as in animal societies, that there is this natural hierarchy that starts to happen, or where people fight to kind of get to the top. But what they were also saying is that there's a natural tendency for us to also be collaborative. And so, and across the world, our cultures are different. So this starts to bring in where you're saying, way too, like, is it just, where does it come from? Where does ambition come from? So I think there are some innate things within us. And yet, of course, there's cultural, there's societal, there's familial, there's a lot of different things that can influence us and help to shape how our ambitions start to take shape. But and one of the things that I loved about some of the reading that I've been doing recently is just this idea of that our world needs a little bit more spaciousness for different types of ambition, if you will. And really, when I say types, it's kind of like what does one's ambition look like? Like, one of the articles I was reading also was kind of saying, like, who's to say that, say, a professional ambition is better than a familial ambition, say, right? So I don't know. There's a lot to play with there and to kind of unpack.
Yeah. So evolutionary, right? That sense of ambition just to be human. I love how you phrase that. And also in our modern day world, I feel like capitalism is a huge piece of feeling the need to be a bit ambitious, and our economy. I know a lot of reading I've been doing, it's this kind of pressure of, if we are not working really hard and working at a fast pace to prove and show our worth and that we're valuable, we kind of need to do that in order to have our career and our job protected in a world of uncertainty. And that kind of ambition and pace, I think, can then throw us off of, like, what are our actual life goals, because we just get trapped in the doing and the needing kind of to survive.
Yeah, it's kind of what's coming to mind for me, Wade, in that is what often gets portrayed in media, say, is this celebration of, like, where did the term even hustle culture come from, right? And or what often gets celebrated is like I was saying earlier, the 30 under 30s, the 40 under 40, the people that move quickly, or the busyness, or the people that are overworking or having a side hustle,
or ran the race the fastest.
Right. Yeah. So, and that's, in one of my recent podcast interviews with an ultra marathoner, what was really fabulous for him to say, in contrast to that, right? He said, you have people at the end of these 100-mile races where the last person in is getting just as much celebration as the first person in, right? It's more about the journey than Beautiful. It is about the actual, like, who won the race. So that's really interesting as well. And it kind of points me to this idea. We all are on our own journey and running our own races, right? Comes back to that kind of comparative narrative that we were talking about.
Yeah. And what's the pace that you want to run your life's journey or walk your life's journey at?
For sure. For sure. That brings up Wade, you're bringing in kind of life's journey too. And, one of the things that can often come up when we talk about, like, personal life is, how does one kind of manage their ambitions or goals for their life when they have a partner? And this is something I know you kind of have talked about. And I think one of the conversations I've had before on the podcast, I don't know if you ever watched the show Borgen, but they talk about where the woman is the prime minister of Denmark, and she and her husband are taking, she's supposed to become prime minister and, kind of take the lead or just, he's going to help take care of the family during that time while, she kind of steps into this big role. And so it's kind of this taking turns in a relationship. It didn't work out so well in that show, but still there's this pacing of kind of like, how do you live your life with your partner or when you have a family, and how do you kind of think about that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh my gosh, this is so real for my husband and I right now. It's something that we're processing as we're exploring the topic of families and, growing in that stage of life. One of the things that we do every year, we've probably been doing it for the last 5, probably even more, 7 years, is a partner review process. And I actually, even because I've been doing it and it's been so helpful for us, I created a little online course that I offer at the end of the year into the beginning of the year around it. But it's really helpful because it sets us down. We carve out like hours of time, light a candle, make it kind of a fun, again, little ritual, and talk about and reflect on how did the last year go? Where are we right now? And then what do we really want to be prioritizing this next year? And we talk about it from a personal perspective as well as a relationship perspective. And it can be as small as things of like, what are house priority projects that you have versus me? Because these are things that you might assume you're on the same page with, but be like, whoa, you really want to prioritize, the building of the shed versus the garden. Like, right. It just is helpful to talk about it because you can't assume. So that is helpful in like, how are we going to pace and set those goals together? I think one of the challenges is around, pace in managing like career ambitions of different cycles and seasons of, who gets to be the breadwinner and what does that get to look like? And does the breadwinner actually spend more time working and work harder or faster than the other person? Is it this, like, it's complex, and setting then those goals and planning for retirement and planning for how much kids cost these days and planning for expanding our house, right? These are all these life and personal goals that we're working on managing and fitting in. And I think reminding, something I have to remember all the time is it all doesn't have to get done this year. Like, it's not, and that is really helpful because I'm like, oh, if it's in my mind, that means it has to get done. But just so that helps kind of slow down the pace or the internal pressure that I can put on us. But what about you, Kathy? I mean, you and your husband have been married longer than me and my husband. I'd love to hear wisdom that you have as a relationship.
Yeah, I mean, we're celebrating our 20th anniversary this year, which I'm quite proud
Amazing.
of. I know. And, it's interesting. I'll admit we don't have kids, so I think that makes things a little bit easier. And yet, even as I say that, we absolutely have cadenced things in our lives or in our careers, and maybe a little bit more naturally than necessarily planned. So even at a time when, like, okay, my husband left his job and he wanted a little bit more flexibility and he was doing consulting, meant that I stayed in my full-time job even though I was desperate to take a sabbatical, and yet I stayed in a job for 2 or 3 years longer than I probably would have wanted to because we needed that income stability. And we, it was just how things were working out with each of our careers. Versus now, I'm kind of doing this, my independent, my business, and he has a full-time job. And so we have that stability and healthcare through his role. And so we definitely talk about these things, but it's been a little bit more fluid, but we're present to it so that we understand how are we being responsible, right, while supporting these different ambitions that each of us has. I think one of the things too that we've done is that we've also, I think, been very supportive of each other when we've wanted to downshift. So I don't think my husband will mind that I share this, and I think it's a reality and it's true, which is, prior to us getting married, he had been working in a corporate job for many years, had a great paying job, and he decided to do a pivot. And he's always loved woodworking, and he ended up quitting his job. This is prior to us getting married, and he took a job in a fine woodworking shop, and did that for about 2.5 years to see, hey, I want to actually, this passion thing that I had, do I want to make that my job? And so that was a time when I was supporting his creative endeavor and wanting to explore that in his career, and I took the corporate job and was kind of the primary breadwinner. He was definitely earning income, but not what he used to, and not at the level that I was doing. And so that's how we've kind of taken different stages in our career where we've each supported each other. And he kind of does the same for me, has done the same for me at different stages as well.
Hmm. Yeah, and I've seen some other relationships model, both partners can be ambitious and there can be sustainability in their goals and they're working and they can't do it all. So that's when they also hire additional help, and there's ways, because I think that's a mentality that we have in our individualistic American culture society of like, I can do it all by myself. And if I ask for help, I'm weak, or that means I'm not strong, or, whatever the other internal dialogue. But sometimes it's just smart, right? We need it because we do have limited time and attention. And if we want to go far and fast and have big income and impact, we will probably need support, right? We need teams. We need to work together to achieve big things.
For sure. Yeah, and what came to mind as you were saying that, Wade, is one of my favorite lessons from Brene Brown. Even if I haven't fully like always used this, I think it's something that's really powerful that I think couples can tap into, which is she talks about a time in her career where her husband is a physician and has a busy work schedule, and there's been times in her life where she writes about this in one of her books, where she talks about where she has her speaking career and she's been on the road and she's, he's had a busy day, and then she comes home and is like, he's kind of like, hey, I've been with the kids all week, it's your turn, and she's had a busy week on the road. And essentially she would come home and they essentially learned that they needed to check in and be like, okay, where are you at in terms, I'm not going to forget exactly the word she
I
used.
totally know. Yes.
Yeah.
Like, what's your capacity right now?
Exactly. Yeah. And it's kind of like, okay, well, I only have 20% capacity left and this person only has 10, right? And so you're both kind of at the end, but it's like the person with 20 is going to step up, and it's kind of like, hey, the 10% person needs to go get rejuvenated before they can kind of then come in and kind of
Tag
take the
team.
lead. Yeah, and tag team. And I think that's a really smart thing to do, and to just be really present with each other. Like, hey, how do we support each other in this thing, in this journey called life?
Yeah, and I think that's a huge, what's coming alive for me is you shared this, and I've heard Brene talk. I think she talks about that in one of her talks too. Or maybe it's her podcast. I don't know. I hear her voice in my head as you share the story. But is that in order for it to be sustainable, we need community. We can't do it alone. And I think that is so essential. And whether you have a partner or you're not, like, you still need community. You need a network of people who have your back or can help you hold the load or can help you process things or help you have clarity so that you can go still have that big impact.
I think that's really, really important. I feel like community and who you surround yourself with and that support system is coming up so much in so much of the research that I'm doing. And I think we've often forget how important that community really is in helping us strive and sustain, and like you're saying, Wade, actually go out and have the kind of impact that we need or want to have, that we need, really, that we want to have out in the world. Yeah. I'm curious, Wade, like where you might think we have challenges around finding pace around goals. Like I'll throw one out that I feel relates to this topic that we've been talking about, because I think that one of the things that happens, and I mentioned it earlier, is that I think ambition can ebb and flow, and that sometimes we want to slow down and take our pace down around goals. And I think oftentimes what I hear from people is that they feel guilty, like they've been ambitious in the past, and it's not like they're completely not ambitious, but it's just they're like, I just don't want to be operating at the pace that I had been operating at. And so they're like, I want to take things down a notch, but it feels really uncomfortable. And there's both this sense of, again, maybe there's, because of the external societal pressure, that there's a little bit of guilt, but they find it challenging to kind of allow themselves to step into that. And maybe there's a little bit of fear of judgment as well behind that. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, what you're framing right now reminds me of a conversation I had with a client the other week who she's a young mom and one kid, and the kid is almost a year. And so she's been back to work, the last 6+ months. And she's realizing work is a lot. It's a lot to have a little kid. It's a lot to work. And she has a pretty big position at a small startup. And she's kind of wanting to downshift part of her and to be able to downshift at work, but upshift in mommy time, mommy time and attention. And she can't do both, right? She can't upshift both. And I think that is what's really hard for, I'll just say people, because I don't think it's just women. I think women have, a lot of the pressure to be more mommy centric. But I would say people, I'm sure dads feel this way too, is, how do you decide where your ambition gets to go? Because ambition shouldn't just be about work, right? It should be about the goals, life goals that you have, that you talk about, Kathy, in your book, and having that clarity around it, because it is ambitious to have a kid. It is ambitious to grow a family, and how you can honor that. But yet there's this internal conflict she was feeling of, I'm afraid that people at work are going to think I'm not capable. And then what's going to happen to my career and my advancement? And if I get taken off of a project, like, what does that mean for my sense of self and my sense of identity? And so I think it can be really challenging when we then have a conflict of ambition, when our values are at conflict and how we want to be exerting and growing and challenging ourselves. So we definitely talked about that. We talked it through. And I think just the having like a expectation reset, I think is so important, because we put this like super woman image out there that we can do it all, be it all the time. But that's, again, not sustainable, right? We talk about sustainable ambition. So really, like, what are the clear expectations you have, I think is essential.
Yeah, this is something, it's so interesting what you're bringing up, Wade, this conflict of ambition. And I think it can show up in a number of different ways. So, this idea of kind of like, just to simplify things, say professional life versus personal life kind of ambitions, and how do you navigate that, right? And that can get conflicted by societal norms, right? And how those are perceived. And then, gosh, workplace norms. And this is one where I think that we workplaces, I think, need to shift in terms of how they think about this. Personally, I think that pacing is something that needs to be brought into the mindset of workplaces. It's kind of like, because it used to be that the majority of people that went to the office were men and were leaders. Unfortunately, there's still too, that's where it leans, and not enough women leaders. But that there isn't this conscientiousness that, hello, like, a natural part of human life is that people have families and babies are born. And what does that mean? And how does that need to factor into how our society functions? And we still haven't adjusted to that. And so, there are these things that kind of get in the way of people being able to manage those different ambitions. But yet, even saying that, there are, just as you're saying, these uneasy, even if you took away those societal kind of pressures, if you will, or boundaries, I still think what you're describing is like, people themselves feel these natural tensions. And I've heard it from clients too, and they wrestle with them, and they're kind of like, how do I find some spaciousness with this? And I don't know if it's always easy to kind of come to terms with that.
Yeah. And I would say clients who are in corporate, who are really ambitious in their work life, and yet corporate is kind of the one that's being the block, because there's a slower process in the promotions or in the switching of the teams, or there's kind of a dance that needs to be done that they don't have control of the timing. And so to then that can be a huge block, and then in feeling ambitious there, and their interests could wane, and that's where they start to get maybe a little antsy or don't see a place for their growth or trajectory there, and so then start to pivot and want to look elsewhere. So that also, shows up as a big block for people on how they get to grow and stretch their ambition.
For sure, because there aren't these like models or forms or ways to allow them to kind of still play with these models. It's interesting. I was a part of a conversation recently where I was hearing people talk about in this one organization where it's kind of like has more traditional work norms, hasn't worked with contract workers and people that only work 2 or 3 days a week, where they're saying like we really need to break down this model. And I often go back to the movie 9 to 5, where it's kind of like they had all these different, things. It's like 1980 where this movie came out, and it's like a long time ago. And yet we still like, where did job sharing go? Where did some of these like on site daycare go? Like, I mean, these things that we would have thought could have become norms to facilitate people being able to be both ambitious about life and work haven't really taken shape. And what I'm hearing you say, Wade, is like, how do we in our society allow for different models, right, to take shape that better support people in navigating this?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this then opens up the whole can of worms of what's happening in our government, and actually how are corporate cultures using their money and resources to give back to community culture, and what's that whole system look like? So yeah, I mean, this is a huge topic.
I know. We're gonna solve it here.
Right now, fast pace.
Yes, exactly. Well, I mean, one of the things that I think is coming up for me in this too, because you were saying there's can be this conflict of ambition, and one of the things that I think about in this too, and it actually takes us back to the start of the conversation, and maybe this will bring us back, and we can start to wrap up, Wade. But because I also think that there can be conflict of ambition where we can be ambitious about wanting to do multiple things at once, and yet we can't do it all at once. And so how do we think about it? Brings us back to that cadencing again, where I talk about these different arcs. And I think there's arcs in life as well as around one's work, where you're kind of like, what is it time for now? And so I just want to bring that forward, because I think that's one way for people to think about when they're wrestling with these conflicts. And I think it is to think about, what is it time for now? What is this arc about? And I think it might bring in this conversation too when we were talking about partners as well, in terms of how do you each cadence supporting what is present for the other, or what's present for one's family. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is that we get to unhook from all of these societal mental maps that are out there. So, for instance, I was just having drinks with a bunch of girlfriends the other night, and a lot of them are getting antsy to switch careers, and some don't want to stay in the same career trajectory. And that's kind of swirling this whole question of, well, if I wanted to pivot completely, like, what would that look like? And would I be able to stay in the same pay bracket? And, all the things that kind of, what would my role be and title and all those things that there's curiosity around. And I think we get to remember that we can be ambitious and have these huge pivots at any point, at any stage of our life. I had a family friend growing up who went back to law school at the age of 50 and completely shifted his career. He was a stay-at-home dad and went back to law school and became a lawyer, and is working full-time as a lawyer still. And so just how it doesn't have to look like what we think or it should look like. And I think getting clear on all of the shoulds is huge. And that's where it's important to tap in and to listen to what's internal, so that we can know what actually is important to me, and what arc do I want to use your language, what arc do I want to focus on right now?
Yeah, For sure. For sure. That just brought up for me, and I'm just going to throw this in really quickly, which
Please.
is this idea that, when I think about pacing and long-term goals, and even as you're saying, because as I was listening to you saying, your friend in that 50, like going back to school and shifting gears, like it just springs up like it's never too late too. Like even though, you started with like, oh my gosh, must meet my
The
goals
panic.
right away. The panic, yeah. And then it's kind of also like, oh, and it's never too late to kind of go and try different things. And it's funny because I actually have some people in my world who've been fortunate living in Silicon Valley. Not surprising that I have some people in my network who've been fortunate and they've retired pretty early. And I also have, and somebody in my family who retired pretty early, and I now see them at the age of approaching 80. And I'm like, I look at both of those two things. So people kind of in their late 40s, early 50s already retired, somebody who retired in their early 50s and like now getting close to 80. And I look at that and I'm like, oh my gosh, if I check out or I don't stay engaged or I don't have some pacing to interests in my life, like I get nervous I'm going to be bored. And so like there's, to me, pacing and goals also kind of for me becomes how do I stay engaged in life and how do I make sure that because my engagement in growth and learning is like really important for me. So I think that at least for me, this idea of pacing has real practical measures to kind of like my overall life happiness.
Yeah. And I think that's really important to recognize is like the gift of goal setting, the gift of having these clear objectives. And as I'm hearing you talk about it, Kathy, like ways you get to live your values of growth, of impact, of, it sounds like stimulation, creativity, like all these other things I know about you. And I think sometimes we can white knuckle or attach too much weight to the end result of that goal or that outcome that we can then miss the journey, talking about, back to racing. And how can we be present for it all? That it's not just about getting to that end goal, but it's like, how can we enjoy the pacing of the journey to it and know that's just as important.
Yeah, I love that, Wade. Well, I'm wondering if I'm going to like kind of close with just a final thing, perhaps that I'd love to kind of leave folks with, and just something, if they're listening to this conversation where we've kind of, we didn't plan this. It was like a little, I don't know if this followed a thread for folks, but I think I'll pull it together in this way that my hope for those of you listening is that what you'll start to think about is like, what do I want for myself in my life?
Mm-hmm.
What do I want this journey to be about? And how am I going to pace things for myself and allow myself and give myself that permission to kind of set my own pace, whatever that might look like for you.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and I'll just build on that beautiful point, right? And to really untangle from the shoulds of life and to recognize that your own journey is your beautiful, unique own journey. And it can be hard to set those expectations down of other people. But what really matters is, your own values, your own life, and the impact that you want to create in this world.
Love that, Wade. Well, this has been fun to be in these conversations.
So fun to
pace.
geek out. Yeah,
Yes.
Geek out around this. And I feel like for me, just so many seeds have been planted, and I'm excited to continue to walk with this theme and notice where else it starts to show up in my life.
Same. Thanks so much for being in conversation, Wade.
Thanks, Kathy. Thanks so much for listening to the Center in the City podcast. If you have a friend that comes to mind that you think of when you think of pace, when you think of ambition, when you think of goal setting, send this episode to them. Spark some conversation and connection with a friend of yours. And until next time, stay centered.